My 50 False Friends in the King James series on YouTube is done. I'm stopping at 50 and therefore retroactively calling it 50 False Friends in the King James Bible. And I have two major announcements to make about the series in this long video. One of them will appear at the beginning of the video and one at the end. I'm kind of like Walmart putting the milk jugs at the back to make you walk through the whole store. And this is a super Walmart, a big video. Sorry, and you're going to pass 10 aisles on your way to the dairy section. My answers to the top 10 objections I've received to my work on False Friends in the King James. Some of you YouTube viewers will recognize your comments, though I don't plan to critique anyone by name. But first, my first big announcement. Tablet roll, please. I have laboriously, with the help of a student, counted the number of times my 50 false friends appear in the King James. I'm offering a concrete number as a challenge to my King James only brothers to realize that they are, at best, standing in real tension with the teaching of 1 Corinthians 14. Edification requires intelligibility. I am now ready to announce a final tally. My 50 false friends appear as false friends a total of 1,362 times in the King James Version, out of 2,516 total occurrences of these words. Note carefully what this means. The word meat, for example, occurs 242 times in the more general sense of food, and I think nearly all English readers will fail to realize that that's what the King James translators intended in those places. Food, not the flesh of animals. For example, and I just learned this while doing this work, when the Jerusalem Council forbids meats offered to idols in Acts 15, the King James translators were not talking about the edible flesh of animals. They were talking about food of any kind that is offered to idols. But this word meat in the King James Version does occur 55 times in the sense of the edible flesh of animals, which is precisely what today's readers will think the word means. Today's readers will not misunderstand the intent of the King James translators in these places. In other words, the word is not a false friend every time it occurs. Through the vagaries of language change, which no one can predict or control except God himself, the senses of meat have shifted out of phase with the senses it has today. But they haven't done so completely. It took me hours, actually, to look through every single instance of this one word, meat, in the King James, to determine whether the original text referred in each case to the flesh of animals or to the more general food. I had to look at every one of the many Hebrew and Greek words that the word meat translates in the King James. 17 Hebrew words and 15 Greek words. I and a student of mine went through the whole list of 50 false friends doing this kind of tabulation. How often do these words appear as false friends? And that list is going to be made available to the public in time to come. Look for it in the show notes to this video. Now, why did I stop at 50 false friends in the King James? I stopped in part because I began to find that language just doesn't fit into neat categories, and it was hard to tell sometimes whether a word was a dead word or a false friend. I stopped, too, because I have a wife and 3 kids and a job, and I am now an assistant pastor. I stopped because some false friends were getting so subtle that I could see why certain critics weren't finding them persuasive. I stopped, finally, because 50 is enough to make my point. And here's my point. Christians who insist on the exclusive use of the King James Version need to know that there are at least 50 false friends in the King James Version, which appear 1,362 times in the King James out of 2,516 total occurrences of those words. I believe there are more false friends, and I've written down a number. Some are in my book, but still to this day, I haven't been able to bring myself to read the King James solely in order to find them all. The 50 I've put in my series are words that I have good evidence many readers will misread, through no fault of the King James translators, nor of their own reading ability or educational levels, but solely because language changes over time. Some on the list of 50 are harder, others are easier. Some tripped me up, some I've always understood. But every one of them, I have argued, will trip up at least a significant percentage of contemporary Bible readers. My conclusion: it is wrong to insist that Christian people use one and only one Bible translation when that translation is 400 years old and contains words they don't realize they're misunderstanding, especially when the New Testament teaches that edification requires intelligibility. That was my argument, that was my point, that was my conclusion. But I have to admit that my point was not persuasive to everybody on YouTube, and I am shocked My mom always said when I was growing up, if you tell the truth with your whole heart, son, YouTube will believe you. Nobody had any idea what she was talking about back in the 1980s. Now I know. And apparently, for once, my poor mother was wrong. I would like one more opportunity to answer these critics, because I need to bring this phase of my work on the King James to a close. This is the kind of close that might get opened up again if need be. I'm not promising to say nothing on the topic ever again, but I want to get past the King James Version. I want to move on to other topics on this channel. So as a hefty wrap-up to my entire 50 False Friends series, I'm going to try to boil down the negative comments that I've received publicly and privately into 10 main objections. Top 10 lists are very popular, you know, and I'm kind of hoping that I can win some of David Letterman's former audience now that he's off air. The first two and the last one are really the most important. The first two constitute one of the least accurate and then one of the most important and weighty objections that I've received. The last, the 10th, will help me segue into the next phase of my channel, Lord willing, and its argument. So if you don't have time for all 10, watch 1, 2, and 10. I will provide chapter breaks in the notes on this video. If you are in solitary confinement or in lockdown during a global pandemic and you've watched all the clean Netflix shows there are, I will permit you to watch all 10. Objection number 1. You're saying that the King James Version is impossible to read. This is by far the most common objection I received to my work on the King James, and to my False Friends series in particular. I predict that this will be the standard anti-Mark Ward line for all time, that it will be repeated over and over till after my death at the hands of an assassin sent by aliens loyal to Peter Ruckman in the year 2027. But in the remaining 6 years of my life on this planet, I will keep repeating that I do not believe the King James Version is impossible to read. I know why people think I'm saying the King James is impossible to read, but I want to say here categorically, it isn't. Obviously, many people do read the King James. I read the King James growing up. It was not all gobbledygook to me. On the whole, it's not impossible to read for most reasonably educated English speakers. And it belongs, in general, to the modern period of English that we still inhabit. I'm saying something much more specific, far less vague. I'm saying that hundreds of words in the King James are dead words, obsolete lexemes, to use the technical terminology, that the vast majority of English speakers never use and therefore do not know. I haven't counted these dead words because plenty of King James only organizations already have. I refer you to the list produced by the Trinitarian Bible Society, for example, which comes in at just over 700. I'm saying that is a problem, and it shouldn't be. We shouldn't have words we don't know in a Bible translation when equivalents we do know from our English are available. For most of these dead words, I think we do have well-known alternatives, like broom instead of besom, immorality instead of chambering. I'm also saying, more importantly, that 50 words in the King James Version are false friends, words we don't know, and that they appear 1,362 times as false friends. 1,362. That's the number I'm claiming. Something has to be done with it. And yet, I had hundreds of comments from King James only brothers and sisters on my YouTube videos in the 50 False Friends series. A few of them dedicated a great deal of time to answering me, and I gave real time answering them. I actually really enjoyed exchanges with 2 King James only brothers in particular, and one of them massively changed his tune and started dialoguing respectfully with me. I really appreciated that. That was awesome, an answer to prayer. But after 30 videos and 50 examples, plus more videos and other topics related to the King James, I can't remember a single time when a King James only commenter said clearly, yes, the false friend you explained here is indeed misleading because of language change, and I myself didn't realize I was being tripped up until I watched your video. No. All King James only commenters insisted that they already knew each given false friend, or that it was easily understood with minimal effort, checking context, checking dictionaries, noticing other uses of the word in the King James. As far as I can tell, I went 0 for 50 with my King James only commenters, an F- squared. Those 2 that I most enjoyed talking to did both acknowledge to me that false friends do exist in the King James, but neither one ever named a specific false friend that they admitted was a false friend, and neither ever admitted to learning anything from my videos. Even though I don't mind saying that I myself was surprised by many of my own discoveries, a number of which were sent to me by nerdy friends. What am I to make of this? my King James only brothers are denying the problem of false friends, and they're representing my view in words I can't agree with, namely that the King James is impossible to read. They're painting me as being extreme, as if I'm saying that the whole King James is impossible, instead of that 1,362 instances of 50 words are at various levels of misleading because of language change. This is regrettable. What can I say? I pray that my brothers will interpret me carefully and charitably, responding to what I actually said rather than what they kind of wish I'd said, because it's easy to dismiss. Objection number 2. 1 Corinthians 14 is not talking about Bible translation. I've taken this objection very seriously, and I'm going to spend some real time on it here because it's come from some of the most gifted critics that I have, because it's come repeatedly, and because I live my life in holy fear of misrepresenting God as I teach His Word. I spent as many years in school as I did because I was so disgusted with bad Bible interpretation in preaching, and so delighted and instructed and challenged by good Bible exposition. I want to do good, faithful exposition. My first response to this objection, then, is to try to lead you through my reasoning. I'll get to a second response in a bit. I read a passage like 1 Corinthians 14, and I can hardly think of a place in the entire Bible where the writer states a principle so clearly and states it so many times. The principle is edification requires intelligibility. The situation, though, is one I have personally never faced. It's the use of the gift of tongues in church. Look how many times in this passage Paul repeats the principle. By my count, it's 9-ish. Paul establishes the principle pretty gently in the first paragraph. Pursue love and earnestly desire the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy. For one who speaks in a tongue speaks not to men but to God, for no one understands him, but he utters mysteries in the Spirit. On the other hand, the one who prophesies speaks to people for their upbuilding and encouragement and consolation. The one who speaks in a tongue builds up himself, but the one who prophesies builds up the church. Now, I want you all to speak in tongues, but even more to prophesy. The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets, so that the church may be built up. Tongues is great, but prophesying is better, because prophesying builds up the church. It gives them not just upbuilding, but encouragement and consolation, Paul says. The downhearted get hope, the weak get strength, just through words. And if you ask Paul, why is it that prophesying edifies the church and tongues doesn't, he explains. Now, brothers, if I come to you speaking in tongues, how will I benefit you unless I bring you some revelation or knowledge or prophecy or teaching? That is, tongues are foreign languages that bring the church no benefit because no one can understand them. Prophecy and teaching, on the other hand, use the language of the congregation, so they can bring benefit. Then Paul introduces two metaphors to explain and illustrate and drive home what he means: musical instruments in general and military bugles in particular. If even lifeless instruments, such as the flute or the harp, do not give distinct notes, how will anyone know what is played? And if the bugle gives an indistinct sound, who will get ready for battle? If you strum the chords inside a piano, you get sounds, sort of the same sounds that are in a Rachmaninoff piano concerto, but you don't get music. And if the bugler plays a random series of notes, none of the soldiers will know what to do. He's got to play the right tune. Paul says, so with yourselves, if with your tongue you utter speech that is not intelligible, how will anyone know what is said? For you will be speaking into the air. There are doubtless many different languages in the world, and none is without meaning. But if I do not know the meaning of the language, I will be a foreigner to the speaker, and the speaker a foreigner to me. So with yourselves, since you are eager for manifestations of the Spirit, strive to excel in building up the church. Let me make extra explicit what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that what Paul says about words teachers use in church must also obviously apply to words they use in Bible translations. It's Bible teachers who make Bible translations, and whenever possible, they should translate the Bible using intelligible words, words known by the average person. It isn't just common sense that tells us this, although it most certainly does. It's Bible. I am also arguing that what Paul says applies in degrees, not just in toto. Yes, obviously, Paul in 1 Corinthians 14 is contrasting totally foreign languages with the local lingua franca, whatever it is, the language people know. But what if only 5% or 10% or 32% of what someone says in the pulpit is unintelligible? Then I think Paul would say the same thing. Brother, you need to give attention to speaking in a way that people can understand so that you can build them up. Maybe you don't sound like a complete foreigner. Your speech isn't complete gibberish, but the portions where you're not making sense or are being misleading or are sprinkling in fancy French phrases, you got to work to eliminate those, because edification requires intelligibility. Now, let me try another tack or two. What Bible passage do you use to argue with the Roman Catholic priest who gives the whole service in Latin? This still does happen today, the Tridentine Catholics. This was utterly common for centuries, hardly to be remarked upon. Countless millions of people willingly sat through such services. What a shame, and forgive me, but I really feel this way. How degrading. There was beauty in those services too, sure. Latin has clean vowels and consonants. It's wonderful for singing. I love Western choral music, and I've learned some Latin just so I can enjoy the Agnus Dei and the Nunc Dimittis. But nothing fills me with more dread than imagining old ladies worshiping the pickled tongue of St. Anthony while a priest intones the gospel words they desperately need to hear, only he does it in a dead language they know not a single word of. I have at least one or two Catholic viewers who have been very warm to me, which I find humbling. I hope they haven't turned off this video in disgust. But I didn't make up the pickled tongue story. It's absolutely real. I'm going to put the link in the show notes to a Carl Trueman article that I got it from. I think you say this to this priest, among other things. Jesus said in Matthew 28 that we need to teach people to observe everything he's commanded. So we've got to translate what he's commanded into language that everyone can understand. And Paul in 1 Corinthians 14 says that if people don't understand the tongue being spoken in church, they cannot and will not be edified. Reformers in the Protestant Reformation did in fact say all this, and here's one of them, Wolfgang Musculus, a former monk and priest himself, who wrote in the 1500s, Catholic priests ask, why is it necessary for the people to understand the Latin words with which we pray, consecrate, and sing in the church? The ignorant multitude ought to adore these words with wonder and devotion, not understand them. The apostle was not unfamiliar with such an argument. Now Wolfgang is talking about Paul. Other people with no less seriousness say, why must what is spoken be understood when the words are in accordance with the apostolic authority of Rome? What is this former Catholic's answer, this reformer? He appeals, at least elusively, to the verse I sign in copies of Authorized when I give them away, 1 Corinthians 14:9. Wolfgang Musculus said, the reason Paul gives to those who ask these sorts of things is because you will be speaking into the air. Okay, now, what do you say to the Roman Catholic priest who, after Vatican II, conducts his services in English, but still gives the Mass in Latin? Is that okay? If most of the words in the service are understandable, especially the homily, but certain traditional paragraphs remain locked away from people's understanding, is that okay? No. I think you say to this priest the very same thing. Read Matthew 28, read 1 Corinthians 14. That's like playing the bugle call for an attack, but replacing a few of the notes with other notes, just a few. Is that okay? Read and obey. The words of the Bible are not magic, and Latin words do not carry special power. Use words people know. Now, what if the priest says, okay, I'll use English, even for the Mass, but today's English just isn't as accurate as the Latin in certain key places, so I'm going to keep using just a few Latin words sprinkled in here and there. Benedictus just means far more than blessed, and Pater Noster is so much more majestic than the ugly and common Our Father. If people don't understand, that's what Latin dictionaries are for. You are aiding and abetting their intellectual laziness. This priest is like Abraham arguing with God before the destruction of Sodom. Can I use 10 Latin words? Okay. How about 5? No and no, friar. Go read Augustine, the founder of your order. What is the use of correct speech if it does not meet with the listener's understanding? There is no point in speaking at all if our words are not understood by the people to whose understanding our words are directed. The teacher, then, will avoid all words that do not communicate, if, in their place, he can use Other words which are intelligible in their correct forms, he will choose to do that. But if he cannot, either because they do not exist or because they do not occur to him at the time, he will use words that are less correct, provided that the subject matter itself is communicated and learnt correctly. This aim of being intelligible should be strenuously pursued, Augustine says. What use is a golden key, in other words, rhetorically beautiful speech, if it cannot unlock what we want to be unlocked? And what is wrong with a wooden one if it can, since our sole aim is to open closed doors? Think with me here. The insistence on the use of Latin in Catholic services to this day is frankly arbitrary, even bizarre. Out of all 7,000 languages of the world, why this one? Well, obviously I know the historical reasons, but where does the Bible tell me to maintain a dead language so I can use it in church? And when Jerome revised the old Latin Bible and produced the Vulgate, that meant the common Latin translation, in the late 4th century, do you think it ever entered his mind that people would be intoning these words solemnly 1,600 years later, even long after Latin ceased to be spoken by anyone except some scholars and priests? The retention of the King James Version in some churches is absolutely parallel to the retention of the Latin Vulgate in Catholic churches. What at first is a salutary practice, having a Bible translation people can read, becomes a tradition, which becomes a badge of identity, which becomes a doctrine, which becomes the sine qua non of an entire institution or group. King James onlyism is on the same track as Vulgate onlyism. It's nowhere near as far down that track, praise God, but it had better stop because trains have a way of barreling on unless brakes are applied. Now, I want to really camp here on this point about 1 Corinthians 14, because if the Bible doesn't teach vernacular translation, then my work is needless or wrong. I'm going to move now to a second response I have to this argument from 1 Corinthians 14. One of the important tools of exegesis is what you would call reception history. How have faithful Christians read and applied 1 Corinthians 14 over time? I think my application of 1 Corinthians 14 is sound, even obvious, but if I'm the only one who's ever applied the passage this way, that decreases the likelihood that I'm right to appeal to it in my argument. I already mentioned one of the reformers who used it. I'm just going to rattle off some commentators in chronological order who've made the same or similar connections between 1 Corinthians 14 and the importance of using intelligible words in church. I'm going to get a mite bit tedious, but this point is important to my argument and important to me. John Gill in the 17th century said that 1 Corinthians 14:9 condemns the practice of the papists, the Roman Catholics, performing divine service in a language not understood by the common people. In other words, Gill thinks that this passage applies not just to speaking in tongues, but to church services in his own day. Matthew Henry says around the turn of the 18th century, "To speak words that have no significancy to those who hear them is to leave them ignorant of what is spoken. It is speaking to the air," he cites verse 9. "Words without a meaning can convey no notion nor instruction to the mind, and words not understood have no meaning with those who do not understand them. To talk to them in such language is to waste our breath." I agree. Hodge says in his commentary on 1 Corinthians in 1857, "It was not the nature of the sounds uttered, but their unintelligibleness to the hearer, which was to be considered. The opposite of easy to be understood is not inarticulate, but unintelligible, that is, what is not in fact understood." So it's not just foreign languages in church, then, that Hodge opposes. It's anything that is not in fact understood by the audience. I think most Protestants are with him so far. But look at what else Hodge draws from this passage. He says that Paul here exposes the folly of those who are fond of a florid style, of bombast words, great swelling words of vanity in their public discourses. This is only speaking into the air with regard to the vulgar, the common people, whose edification should be consulted. And as the end, the purpose, the goal of the gospel ministry is public usefulness and edification. Plainness of speech, words easy to be understood should be used, such as are apt and fit to convey the true idea of things to people in common. These are the acceptable words which the wise preacher who is desirous of doing good to the souls of men will seek out and studiously make use of. You can't make every person understand, but you can make every person misunderstand if you use language that is technically English, but that is inaccessible to your audience. The commentators who produced the Lutheran commentary in 1897 interpreted 1 Corinthians 14 this way: plain words for plain people. The more elaborate and learned mode of discourse should be reserved for the assemblies of those acquainted with such speech. Learning reaches its highest end in the service of the church, when it enables the public teacher to speak with such transparent simplicity and directness that the speaker is forgotten and the message alone makes an impression. Contemporary commentator Tom Wright writes, "What Paul says here is relevant to much wider issues than simply speaking in tongues, and hence to many churches which don't have the same problem that the Corinthians had. What is the point of reading Scripture in such a mannered or elevated tone of voice, that instead of it being heard as the exciting, life-changing word it really is, it comes across as a lofty oracle, very grand perhaps, but totally unrelated to the ordinary life of the listeners?" I checked dozens of commentators on 1 Corinthians, spanning the entire history of the church. Most of them didn't make any application of the text at all. They merely repeated Paul's application of it. This is a bit of a problem with commentators, however much I love them, failing to bring the text into our day. But those who did apply the text to our day all applied it to words in church beyond speaking in tongues. And even among those who stuck with explaining Paul's ancient meaning, just listen to the different ways they translate the key word in 1 Corinthians 14:9. They say that words in church should be intelligible, readily intelligible, easily understandable, clear, readily understood, plain, easily recognizable. We're supposed to use words like well-painted, large-lettered signs, signs pointing in a clear direction that no one could mistake unless they're trying. And now I've saved my coup for the grace. Call me a hypocrite if you want for using French. My audience here is not the hoi polloi, but the cognoscenti. Listen to one of the major leaders of British King James Onlyism, Malcolm Watts, who, by the way, is a truly eloquent speaker and a gracious man with a lot of good to say alongside his regrettable King James Onlyism. Watts was the longtime head of the Trinitarian Bible Society, one of the most important institutions promoting King James Onlyism in the world, and the people who put out this Westminster Reference edition of the King James I'm holding now. And this is what he said in a lecture arguing for the necessity of Bible translation. There's biblical teaching about this, in other words, Bible translation. In 1 Corinthians 14:9, we read these words, "Except ye utter by the tongue words easy to be understood, how shall it be known what is spoken? For ye shall speak into the air." And in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul develops that, and he shows the necessity for translation, that ordinary men and women, the common people of the land, might be able both to discern the meaning and profit from the blessing of God's word written. Immediately after these words, Watts quotes the preface to the King James, the same preface I'm continually quoting in my videos. Watts says, "One of the loveliest things written about translation," and I totally agree, "appears in the preface to the Authorized Version in 1611, written by a man called Miles Smith. And this is what he says: Translation it is that openeth the window to let in the light, that breaketh the shell that we may eat the kernel, that pulleth aside the curtain that we may look into the most holy place, that removeth the cover of the well so that we may come by the water." So, Malcolm Watts, one of the world's leading King James onlyists, uses 1 Corinthians 14 to prove the necessity of Bible translation. And last and certainly not least, guess who uses 1 Corinthians 14 to defend the need for Bible translation into the vernacular? The King James translators. In that same famous and excellent preface, Translators to the Reader, they make an argument for the necessity of translation, and they appeal precisely to 1 Corinthians 14. How shall men meditate in that which they cannot understand? How shall they understand that which is kept close, that is hidden in an unknown tongue? As it is written, "Except I know the power of the voice, I shall be to him that speaketh a barbarian, and he that speaketh shall be a barbarian to me." That's straight from 1 Corinthians 14. And the lesson they ultimately draw, the conclusion they come to in this section of their argument is this: "Indeed, without translation into the vulgar tongue, the unlearned are but like children at Jacob's well, which was deep, without a bucket or something to draw with." We can debate whether or not the King James translators succeeded in reaching the unlearned, but this is what they said their goal was: translating the Bible into the language of the very vulgar. We can debate how easy a Bible translation should get, But we can't debate that 1 Corinthians 14 has been used by faithful Christian interpreters over many centuries to apply to issues other than speaking in tongues, and that the King James translators themselves used it to argue for the necessity of Bible translation into the vernacular. We're only now finishing objection 2, but I just got the big ones out of the way. The others will, I promise, cross my corazón, be faster. Objection number 3. What we need is not a readable Bible, but an accurate one. This argument was used recently at a conference by a professor at a major King James only college, a guy who's actually a friend of mine, a brother in Christ I enjoy talking to and emailing with. I have good reason to believe that he was responding to me, and I've heard this from other commenters too. But it makes me want to ask, should people feel guilty for wanting to understand every word they read, not just most of them? If I were recommending that people replace their King James onlyism with the Message onlyism, this response about accuracy trumping readability would carry weight. The Message is not an accurate Bible translation because it's not a translation, it's a paraphrase. In that case, someone could rightly say, accurate translation is more important than ease of understanding. You've let ease of understanding so far outweigh accuracy that you've gotten the two values completely out of balance. But if accuracy trumps readability, then shouldn't we just be using the Greek and Hebrew? They're the only inspired texts. No, this objection is a false dichotomy. We want accuracy and readability, as much as we can get of both. Let me repeat a quote that I made in Authorized the Use and Misuse of the King James Bible. If a translation is published, but fails to communicate, is it really a translation? Here again, we can speak in degree. To the degree that a published translation fails to communicate, it's not a translation, and it is therefore not accurate. Accuracy and readability entail each other. Unless you're going to say that the Bible cannot be understood at a given place, in that case, an unreadable translation is fine, it's called for. But if God inspired Scripture to be understood, then it can be understood in translation. If God inspired the Hebrew equivalent of the word broom, there's no biblical reason to use the word besom when broom is available. And there's a good biblical reason in 1 Corinthians 14 not to use besom, for the simple reason that it will not edify. I said that would be faster. Here's objection number 4. Okay, it would be great to have an update of the King James if all they did was update the English. But alas, no one has done this. This objection is partly right. Even the New King James and the Modern English Version, which use the same base Hebrew and Greek texts as the King James, and hew closely to the King James, often do more than update the English. They're both super close to the King James, super close. So is the English Standard Version, for that matter. But I admit, there's no translation in existence that merely updates the English of the King James. I've tried to do this kind of work, and it's extremely hard. It sounds easy. It's just not. It's simply not. That's because King James English isn't just words. It's word order and syntax and punctuation and other things. How far do you go in making it more like our English? That's a very difficult question to answer. So I'm going to concede this point, objection 4, sort of. I'm going to answer it by turning to the next objection, objection 5. Here it is. But the King James is perfect. You can't change the Word of God. A significant percentage of my commenters have indicated that they believe the King James Version to be perfect, every jot and tittle. When I have shown explicit evidence that the King James translators did not regard their work as perfect, they have said that the King James translators are wrong, or that the author of the preface, Miles Smith, was not truly representative of the King James translators, even though the preface is titled From the Translators to the Reader. Look at what commenters have said to me. I'm not a Ruckmanite. I don't think the King James is better than the originals. I think it's a perfect translation of the originals. Here's another. The King James is the perfect words of God. All modern Bibles are fake. If it is not perfect, then it is not the words of God. And another. Mark Ward, God did not give you the permission to change his words. I very rarely see leaders of mainstream King James onlyism pushing back against this kind of talk. But hear me clearly. This is false doctrine, my friends. The Bible does not teach us to expect perfect translations, and the King James translators told us their work was not perfect. They said in words I've practically memorized, I've had to use them so often, there is no cause why the word translated should be denied to be the word or forbidden to be current, that is used, spread around, notwithstanding that some imperfections and blemishes may be noted in the setting forth of it. And then they ask a rhetorical question. Now, whatever was perfect under the sun, where Apostles or apostolic men, that is, men endued with an extraordinary measure of God's Spirit and privileged with the privilege of infallibility, had not their hand. When I've quoted this line, commenters have told me that the King James translators were, quote, super geniuses, but that they were wrong on this point. Even though everything else they did inside the covers of the King James was perfect, apparently the inspiration of the Spirit only extended to the 66 books of the Protestant canon, and not to the front matter, or the Apocrypha that was also in the 1611 edition. Or maybe the Apocrypha was inspired too? I've never heard any of my King James-only brothers pontificate on whether the King James translators made a perfect translation of the Apocrypha. So this answers the previous objection too. You might have a pragmatic reason for updating only the English of the King James and never changing the translation decisions that they made. Where the Greek or Hebrew could go two slightly different ways, you might choose always to go the way of the King James, for the pragmatic reason that the King James is already accepted and there's no need to ruffle people's feathers. But you can't have a theological or a biblical reason for refusing to change any of the King James translators' translation decisions. Or that is, you can't have an orthodox theological biblical reason for this refusal. Only if the King James translators were supernaturally protected from error can you say that every translation after theirs must make all the same decisions they did. And here's another thing. In many minor places, other European language translations, German, Spanish, Italian, French, etc., 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 made different translation decisions than the King James translators did. God used them all during the Reformation. Why privilege English? Let me give just one example of a debatable decision made by the King James translators from one of my favorite passages in Scripture, the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 6:27, Jesus says, and I'll start here with the King James, "Which of you, by taking thought, can add 1 cubit unto his stature?" But other translations use a totally different metaphor. Here's the ESV. "And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life?" Why do these translations differ? It's not because the underlying Greek texts differ, but because the Greek is genuinely ambiguous. To this day, some translations go with the King James, such as the New King James and the Modern English Version, and even the Christian Standard Bible. Others, such as the NIV and NASB, agree with the ESV. It's rare to find a verse where all the translations are so evenly divided. Who's right? God hasn't told us, so we don't and can't know with certainty. Translators have good reasons for choosing either one, and if you want to understand them, look in a commentary such as D.A. Carson's in the Expositor's Bible Commentary series. Did the King James translators choose the right option? Maybe. Did they receive revelation from God or guidance from His Spirit to choose the right interpretation? No, they specifically denied this, and the Bible never teaches us to expect that Bible translators working in any language will get such Spirit-filled help, revelation, to make perfect choices in the many places where translators could legitimately go more than one direction. The fact is that Spanish translations are equally divided, as are French and Dutch and Portuguese and Italian and German. I checked. The King James follows the Latin Vulgate here, as do all the Reformation-era Bibles that I could easily locate anyway. But the Bible doesn't tell us to look to historical tradition as the final arbiter of truth. The fact is that God has given us a Bible that is, overall, clear when it comes to matters of salvation. But on countless minor points, like which precise metaphor Jesus was using in this passage we're talking about, God has chosen not to give us the level of certainty we might want. Jesus' metaphor works the same in Matthew 6:27 no matter which way you go, with stature or with life length. Worrying won't help you increase either one. We can either be content with this very minor ambiguity or demand that God give us revelation beyond the Bible to tell us what the Bible means. The latter is what extremist forms of King James onlyism have done, and what the mainstream form often implicitly does. Now, objection number 6 goes like this. All you need is the Trinitarian Bible Society's Westminster Reference Bible, or D.A. Waite's Defined King James Bible, or a good dictionary, and you can read the King James just fine. Now, I don't remember in my entire life in church seeing any layperson carrying a King James Bible that had explanatory glosses for archaic words in the margins like these two do. I've seen them carrying beautiful King James editions from Cambridge. I've seen them using the standard Oxford edition in double columns. I didn't even know that King James versions with hard words glossed in the margin existed until after I wrote Authorized the Use and Misuse of the King James Bible. I'm glad they exist. They are a genuine help. I wish all King James readers would use King Jameses with glosses in the margins. I was very nearly hired to produce such a King James Version edition myself, and I still might do it. But I don't think these additions provide a solution to the problem that I'm naming, because I've stood on doorsteps during church visitation while my fellow young evangelists quoted the King James Version to ninth grade dropouts with alcohol on their breath. And there just was no opportunity to say to them, actually, if you look in the margin here, we have turned everyone to his own way, doesn't mean that we have made other people turn to their own way. It just means that every one of us has gone our own direction. It's much easier to just read the NIV. Each of us has turned to our own way. I've given the gospel to countless people, and especially in my younger years when I was still using the King James, often required to do so by various institutions of which I was a part. Even in more recent years, when I've quoted from memory, I have intuitively translated the King James to people while reading or quoting it. I just knew that people wouldn't fully understand if I read or quoted the King James text straight. Our King James only brothers are known for their ardent and faithful evangelism, and this is good. I've often wondered why their vast evangelistic experience hasn't made more of them question King James onlyism. Even if they understand the King James, can't they see how often other people struggle to understand it? Haven't they ever had someone give them a blank stare like I have? Hasn't that ever bothered them? Especially if that someone is their own kid. It doesn't have to be this way. Evangelists and parents need Bible translations that don't require added explanation, because the communication gap to non-Christians and church kids is already large enough. And I've got another response to this argument that all people need is some kind of dictionary, whether a traditional one or one kind of interspersed into the margins of their Bible. I really honestly find it remarkable. I did not expect this, that such a huge number of my King James only brothers have continued to say this to me. I've explained over and over and over. How are people supposed to look up words they don't realize they're misunderstanding? That's what false friends are. I'm not saying there are millions of these words. I'm only claiming 50 false friends that occur 1,362 times. But no dictionary can help people understand words they don't realize they need to look up. I'm not blue in the face or anything. I'm way past blue. I'm on to ash and gray, because I just don't know what else to say. I can't ever seem to get a clear answer to this question. How are people supposed to look up words they don't know they don't know? Objection 7. The ESV, or NIV, or CSB, or NASB, etc., also has difficult words. A friend of my wife asked me after first encountering my 50 False Friends YouTube series, "Are you just doing false friends in the King James or in all versions?" My final false friend, Heavenly Host, does occur in modern Bibles, but effectively, I think, none of the others does. That's because false friends occur because of language change, and modern Bibles use modern English. Sometimes the King James tradition is so strong that a false friend like host can last even in modern Bibles. But I am personally not aware of another such example. I will acknowledge most definitely that modern Bibles contain difficult words, but they don't have false friends. Here's the difference. Those difficult words in modern versions are generally difficult or obscure things, not difficult words per se. I've gone ash and gray in the face saying this one too. An example I always use. We don't have mandrakes in modern America. I don't really know what they are, but they're essential to the story of Rachel and Leah in Genesis 30. They should stay. We should use the word mandrakes. Study Bibles can explain more about what they are. I'd like to subject objection number 7 to a straight-face test. Can you really and truly read a whole book of the Bible in the NIV and tell me it's harder to understand than the King James because of all its difficult words? Pick any single chapter out of the 1,189. Maybe, on occasion, for reasons that translators don't usually get a chance to explain, they choose a harder word than the one the King James has at that place. But overall, the result in the ESV or NIV or NASB or CSB is clearly, to any charitable reader, less difficult than the English of the King James has become over the centuries because of language change. Objection 8. In every field, you have to learn some technical terms. This is one I've started to get more often, and I'm all for people learning technical terms. I can rattle off tons of them from my own academic field of biblical studies, Sitzimleben, redaction criticism, hapax legomenon. I can go on and on and on. It's good for specialists to learn specialized terminology. It makes communication among those specialists more efficient. One little label can stand in for a bunch of ideas. But this is usually the kind of thing that my King James only brothers deplore. Pointy-headed academics who've studied too many years in cemetery for their own good. So it's a little strange for me to hear them all insisting that everybody just needs to learn a bunch of specialized historical English terminology in order to read their Bibles. And it's one thing, to return again to the previous point, to ask people to learn labels for important theological concepts that are difficult, like propitiation or justification. It's another thing to ask them to learn the apparently random and obscure things that language change has done to the current intelligibility of the King James. I keep thinking of "so that," a false friend a reader and friend sent to me. It's one of my favorite examples of false friends because it's just so that. It's so unlikely that anyone would ever notice it. Indeed, I never noticed it. And yet in those few passages that I mentioned in my "So That False Friends" video, our modern sense of "so that" totally ruins the meaning of the verses. It turns them on their heads. By what mechanism, exactly, are King James-only lay people supposed to learn something so obscure? And are King James-only churches actually doing this? Are they making sure that people get King James editions with marginal glosses? Are they offering Elizabethan English reading lessons? No, they absolutely are not. In all my experience, King James-only brothers, even and especially King James-only pastors, are just as likely to be tripped up by false friends as others, like I am. In fact, they're a good deal more likely to be tripped up by false friends for the simple reason that they still read the King James Version and read it exclusively. I'm willing to bet the farm that if you poll 100 King James-only pastors, 95 of them will miss "so that," and at least half of my other false friends. I'd love to put my money where my mouth is. My student and I failed to get grant funding for a Barna survey. We're going to apply again next year, Lord willing. If you have $15,000 to $30,000 lying around, we can put it to good use in a King James readability survey. Defenders of exclusive use of the King James constantly insist to me that to read the right Bible, you just have to learn all the words. And I cannot unhear the echo in these words of what Roman Catholics said about the Latin Vulgate not too many centuries ago. They had dictionaries back then, too. This brings us to objection number 9. Mark Ward is an idiot/fool/ignoramus or some other unprintable epithet. This is called ad hominem argumentation. I have been told I'm the Antichrist, that I'm a liar, repeatedly on that one, that I'm a dummy, repeatedly on that one too, that it's a shame no one ever taught me standard English, that I'm a fake scholar, which I find kind of funny because I studiously avoid calling myself a scholar at all. I truly do not think I am a scholar. I'm a popularizer. I've been asked who's paying me to lie, which is also kind of funny because as of the moment of my writing this script, I have made $6.06 from YouTube monetization, which doesn't quite offset the major expenses I've gone to buy all the equipment to make this stuff, some of which has been provided by my work for other work that I do. I haven't gotten a ton of nasty treatment like this. I haven't gotten as much as I was expecting, to be honest, but I certainly got enough to fill my wood stove or even a faded yellow Chevy Vega. I almost always approve these nasty comments, but several people who used this kind of corrupt talk actually turned to truly vile language, sexually dirty insults. That did surprise me, and I deleted those comments, including from a pastor. I refuse to engage with people who talk in this sinful way because Christ told me not to. It's not possible to know with certainty who counts as swine before whom I shouldn't cast my pearls, but the best clue Christ gives us in that passage, Matthew 7, is that such people turn again and rend you, as the King James says. People who resort to vile insults are best ignored. May God have mercy on these poor souls who hear me call for a readable translation of the Bible into our English and respond by reviling me personally. I'm not angry at them. I'm just sorry for them. And I'll turn now to the final objection, objection 10. Here it is. You are tearing down people's Bible, and what good does that do? My book, Authorized the Use and Misuse of the King James Bible, very self-consciously starts with a chapter telling us all the good things that we're losing as the King James ceases to be our common standard. And it very self-consciously ends with a chapter praising all the good things we gain as the English-speaking church picks up multiple translations instead. Both bookends of the argument are necessary. I love the King James Version. I genuinely love it more now than when I began this work. I feel a sense of loss as I watch some good things it brought us slip away, like the simple ability to make allusions to biblical language that most everyone will catch, and like the avoidance of a bunch of these terrible self-harming debates we're having over Bible translation. If anything ever tempts me toward one version onlyism, it's watching people fight over Bibles. Sometimes I just want to pick one and be done with it. But apart from some work of God's Spirit, this can never happen. What authority or mechanism could possibly unite all English-speaking Christians around the world in the use of one and only one English Bible translation, a new standard? I'm convinced this will never happen again, but I'm just as convinced that tearing down King James onlyism, which is not the same as tearing down the King James, clears the theological ground for building something better in its place. It's the Bible study house that I've been living in for 20 years. Its multiple versions are us. I recognize that for some dear Christian people, this newish building is scary. They feel that if two Bibles disagree, they won't know what to do. There has to be one and only one standard in each language for them. But such people must be taught by faithful pastors that no translation can be fully equated with the Bible. And then they must be shown the value of the use of multiple translations. I've had the words of a good and gracious and godly ex-King James only friend, a graduate of Ambassador Baptist College, who gave me the "so that" example, ringing in my ear since he said them to me about a year ago. If understanding the Bible is our goal in reading it, that puts the entire Bible translation debate into a different light. Indeed, if our goal is merely having the words of God, then why not go back to the Hebrew and Greek? But if our goal is understanding, then we will reach for whatever tools will provide that understanding, including multiple Bible translations, as I've done nearly every day for 2 decades. So this is what I'm turning to. One of my goals for coming years is to help Christian Bible readers learn how to benefit from the use of multiple Bible translations, even if they don't know Greek or Hebrew. Some poor readers will be bewildered by this task. They will do well to read only one translation, and that is okay. But most people who are good enough readers to read through the Bible on their own, which is most English-speaking Christians, at least in the U.S., ought to have basic familiarity with the major evangelical English Bible translations and a basic understanding of how and why they differ. I'm slowly working on a new YouTube series called "That's Not What My Bible Says: Why Translations Differ." I hope eventually to produce a book. I ask for your prayers. It's proving to be difficult work. I recognize that when a translation achieves iconic status, as the King James did in English-speaking Christianity for 3 centuries, the trust rightly invested in it is something that should not be squandered, but instead carefully and lovingly transferred. That transfer process was always going to be a bit messy and to cause collateral damage. But I've often thought of myself as being like one of Isaac Asimov's psychohistorians from his legendary Foundation trilogy. Hear me here. The Galactic Empire may be going down, but we can all work to shorten the chaotic interregnum before a new empire arises. King James is no longer the planet Trantor, and Trantor will not be rebuilt. Many smaller planets are likely to take the place of the one big one. I am working to make the church comfortable with this fact, and to help the church see the benefits of that situation. KJV onlyism is a conspiracy theory. It says that all the biblical scholars who are saying that their new translations are here to help us are actually part of a plot to undermine the truth. Such conspiracy theories demonstrate a crisis of trust in major evangelical Protestant Christian institutions, and that trust must be earned back by unselfish, nay, loving acts on the behalf of people susceptible to these conspiracy theories. The way forward in the King James only debate is not mainly to tear down strongholds, casting down every King James only argument that exalts itself against the truth. It's to give and give and give the goods of orthodoxy and of orthodox biblical scholarship to Christ's sheep. He said they know his voice and they will follow him. If we repeat that voice carefully and lovingly, if we herald its message with clarity, if we lead the sheep to doctrinally rich pastures, we can expect those sheep to respond positively. Let me conclude this video and this 50 False Friends series before my last major quick announcement by saying something clearly to my opponents and critics, minus the few who are truly vile. I still want unity with you, and I do believe in your fundamental sincerity. I want to both invite you and challenge you to demonstrate your sincerity by doing what so far none of my critics has been willing to do. Acknowledge in the comments on just one of my YouTube videos that particular and specific example is legitimate and helpful and taught you something you didn't know. Tell me one time that I'm right. I'll even give you the words to say, wow, this one was interesting. I confess I didn't know that. So that meant the opposite of what I assumed. Thank you for this. I'm your brother. You don't have to fear giving me a millimeter, especially if what I'm saying is true. And it is, brothers and sisters. It is. I promised one more announcement, and it will be super quick. At some point in the not-too-distant future, you should be able to buy my 50 False Friends series in book form. The tentative title is King James Words You Don't Know You Don't Know. I'm praying that my work can not only give King James readers a fish, that is, show them words they aren't understanding. I am praying that it will teach them how to fish, that it will show them how language change affects Bible translation. I am not hoping for the day when no one ever reads the King James. I'm instead praying for the end of KJV onlyism. I am praying to regain unity with my erring brothers and sisters in Christ who have been overtaken in a fault. Lord, open King James onlyism's eyes.